Yes, good morning, everyone. As Milica just pointed out, this paper I'll be presenting today is called Transitioning Fast and Slow, Energy and Geopolitics in the 21st Century. And it was co-authored with Facundo in the back there, but he has kindly given me the honor of presenting it myself. It's always a rather unhealthy thing to begin a presentation with a disclaimer or warning, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm an intellectual historian by training. I am not an energy expert, although that may actually work to my advantage given the ill reputation of many experts in the world today. My area more recently is in classical antiquity, and although the ancients didn't know a lot about climate change, they knew a little bit about different forms of energy, and when it came to public debate, they knew a great deal about hypocrisy, and I can't help but feel that there's a little bit of that in energy policy debates today. Now that being said, my talk then is going to be more of a work in progress from an outsider's perspective, an outsider concerned with the state of public debate on these matters. And therefore I leave it to you to decide whether an intellectual historian's foray into this field was worthwhile or not. And so comments and suggestions at the end for continued work in this field are most appreciated. Okay, I use as the baseline for this paper a report published 2 years ago called A New World, the Geopolitics of the Energy Transformation. And this was done by the Global Commission on the Geopolitics of Energy Transformation. And so what I'd like to do is just begin by very briefly summarizing the general gist of their report and then go into some critiques. Essentially, what the Commission has concluded is that in looking at the future geopolitical position of various states, there are two hinge factors of some importance. One is the extent to which the country is dependent on trade in fossil fuels, and the second is the extent to which the country is invested in renewable energy technologies. And with these two measurements, what the Commission believes is that in the future, countries such as the United States will be very in a good position moving forward, as well as Europe, Japan. I mean, the Energiewende in Germany comes in for special praise, for example. China, too, though, because of its investments in renewables, is also slated to be in a strong position, according to the Commission. Countries that are not so strong are going to be Russia, for example, due to its comparatively lackluster performance in renewable investments, and then other countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, not to mention with little to no renewable investment and with weak economies and structures of governance, such as Libya, Angola, and South Sudan. Now, the hope in general is that the transition to renewables will lead to greater energy independence all across the board and be better for absolutely everyone. It'll lead to greater decentralization, the Commission argues. It will lead to trade that is characterized more by normal instead of natural comparative advantages, and I'll get into that a little bit later in my talk. Finally, choke points such as the Straits of Hormuz or Malacca will become less important. So too will alliances based on fossil fuels, like OPEC, for example. And they predict and hope that alliances based on renewables, such as the International Solar Alliance, forged in the wake of the 2015 Paris Agreement, could become the OPEC of the future. Okay. That's in very broad strokes what the Commission has said here. Now to move on to just some critiques. The first one concerns a notion that pervades the entire report, which is the idea of peak oil, specifically peak oil demand, which they believe that we'll reach by the middle of this decade. I was speaking to my father the other day, and he's far more mentally invested in these matters than I typically am, and he reminded me that some 15 years ago, the big concern was with peak oil supply, but it would seem now that peak oil demand is the big bugbear. Be that as it may, there is no consensus, as far as I can tell, that oil demand will peak within the next 4 or 5 years, and even if it did, there's no indication that its decline would be precipitous. According to the IEA itself, global oil demand this year is 96.2 million barrels a day, and it's going to raise by a further 3.2 million barrels a day next year. Similarly, while a fall in demand is always conceivable due to additional lockdowns or politics, for example, even the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, which is based on severe climate policies, projects global oil demand at 80 million barrels a day in 2040. So oil continues to be make up an incredibly important share of the global energy mix, and several factors contribute to its stickiness. One is its usefulness in the transportation sector. Additionally, unlike some renewable energy sources, petroleum is also used in the production of plastics, solvents, and numerous household items. Additionally, there are fast-growing countries such as India and China whose thirst for oil has not necessarily abated. And what that probably means is that some of these straits in question, or areas such as the South China Sea, will indeed retain their importance for some time to come. 80% of China's oil imports run through the South China Sea, as do 30% of world trade flows, 15 million barrels a day of oil, and a third of the world's liquefied natural gas. So assuming that demand doesn't go down then, scaling back oil production, for example, in the United States, could well work to the advantage of more authoritarian regimes, Russia, the Gulf monarchies, etc. And these regimes then will have more money to invest in their projects and less incentive to reform in a more green direction. So, ironically, for the Biden administration, for example, by throwing away the shale advantage, the U.S. risks implicating itself back in the Middle East, from which it has been trying to extricate itself. Okay, so that's peak oil. The second area is leapfrogging. So this is the notion that the developing world is going to be able to reach the same degree of growth and prosperity that we enjoy here in the West by skipping the dirty phase of industrialization that we went through and going straight to, let's say, solar and wind. For example, I quote here the Commission, by adopting mini-grids and decentralized solar and wind energy deployed off-grid, just as they jumped straight to mobile phones and obviated the need to lay expensive copper-wired telephone networks. Now, the cases are not necessarily analogous, and here I draw primarily on the work of Arthur van Bentham in an article published in 2015, Energy Leapfrogging. He argues that technology leapfrogging needn't translate into energy leapfrogging. Developing countries today have more energy-intensive industries as well as more energy-intensive consumption behavior compared to industrialized countries at the same income level in the past. And moving from wood or coal to solar and wind is feasible only if the latter can provide the same level of growth as conventional fossil fuels. But where the priority for advanced countries is renewables and addressing climate change, developing countries are typically preoccupied with, shall we say, more mundane matters such as growth and survival. And they'll take it on the cheap if they can. More to the point, institutional factors prevail. Energy subsidies and weak environmental policies can hinder the shift to renewables. The upfront costs of renewables may also not be worth it. And even if they are, capital markets in developing countries may not attract investment in the most efficient sectors. Finally, advanced countries' production processes relying more heavily on highly skilled workers and capital may not translate easily into developing countries based more on labor. So that's Bentham, and I would add to that just a couple more general points. One is we see that one of the sticking points for the COP26 negotiations is aid from developed countries to the developing countries. How much, how exactly should it be spent, on what, etc. There's increasing talk in Europe and the United States of carbon tariffs. I wonder if carbon tariffs against some of these emitters, for example, in the third world. I would add that the third world, the developing world, includes countries like China, which is the third biggest recipient of climate-related finance. If so, all of a sudden the developing countries will begin to turn more to, let's say, more flexible countries when it comes to environmentalism, such as Russia and China. I fear that in the worst-case scenario, the West may be accused of some form of, if I give the phrase, but environmental imperialism. The third point, so that's leapfrogging. The third point concerns decentralization and democratization. The Commission assumes that renewables will lead to greater decentralization and democratization. Now, oh, that it were so, because on the face of it, it's quite logical. Wind and sun are more ubiquitous than oil. They don't need to be transported or refined. It's easier for individual households to convert the sun's rays into electricity than to actually set up their own oil rigs and refineries. And so ideally, you could have individual households experimenting with their own configurations of energy production. I mean, it would be a perfect example of Hayekian spontaneous order in action. Sadly, I'm rather pessimistic on this and on many issues in life in general, and I think that the tendency we see in many matters of importance in the world today is towards greater centralization, and I think that's going to remain the case when it comes to energy security. Even with the concerted effort to decentralize energy provision, logistical problems will arise. The size, for example, of wind farms and solar farms relative to their efficiency. If anything, I think we can expect increasingly stringent regulations in clean energy standards, whether the result of environmental lobbyists or overzealous bureaucrats, because after all, they will say that standards must prevail. Energy producers and consumers will have to comply, and so the state might very well relieve them the trouble of by overseeing production, provision, and trade, as it has done in so many other areas of our lives. I'll skip on to the fourth area, which is the Commission uses some dubious dichotomies, and I think as a result makes certain categorical errors. For example, one of the ones that they use is this one between normal and natural comparative advantages. So a country has a natural comparative advantage when it has natural resources like oil fields. But renewables, because they're much less geographically concentrated, this means that a country can specialize in those aspects of renewable energy trade in which it has a comparative advantage based on factors like technology or relative price or cost of transport. But I think that the terms mislead. I don't get the sense that there's anything more normal about a comparative advantage based on technology or price than on geography. Similarly, some countries are blessed with more sun or wind or water, just like we as individuals are blessed with different attributes, be they physical or mental or aesthetic or what have you. At the end of the day, we, much like countries, all make use of the means at our disposal. Or we find new means and uses. Fossil fuels, for example, were not valuable until we found uses to which they could be put. The implication in the Commission's natural-normal dichotomy is that the former, so natural, are unfair advantages because unequal, and that a level playing field is called for. But this is a sort of logic that permits of no end and could end up in inequality of outcome. A more intractable dichotomy persists, though. Contrary to the Commission's assumption, in the quest for clean energy, fossil fuels are not incompatible with renewables or with lowering emissions. We've seen, for example, in recent years, a great deal of the emissions reduction in the United States has been due primarily to the transition from coal to natural gas, from one fossil fuel to another almost equally maligned fossil fuel. And I would mention and this is why you have some people, such as a Czech energy CEO, calling on the EU to classify gas as a green transition fuel. I would mention by the by as well that even if one did successfully argue for the superior affordability of renewables, and as I understand that's a point of some contention, they would still pose problems when it comes to large-scale storage and remain less available and reliable than fossil fuels. As the energy scholar Václav Smil has pointed out, ironically, gas turbines are one of the best ways of providing backup generation. Finally, one of the other areas where fossil fuels are not necessarily the polar opposite of renewables is when it comes to these energy transition minerals like lithium, graphite, nickel, rare earth metals, which are necessary to manufacture everything from electric car batteries to solar panels to wind plants, and whose mining also causes pollution. Steel, additionally, is needed for sources of renewable energy, and 70% of global steel is produced with blast furnaces that burn coal in order to remove oxygen from the iron ore. ETMs, the energy transition minerals, are required in greater quantities for green energy machines than conventional energy machines, and so demand for them could skyrocket. According to the World Bank, demand could rise by more than 450% by the year 2050 if countries hold to the Paris Agreement. The other problem is where a lot of these minerals are located. So we know that cobalt, half of the global supply of cobalt is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. 80% of lithium is in Australia, Chile, Argentina, 60% of manganese, South Africa, China, Australia. But the killing point, perhaps the most important figure, over 85% of the global supply of rare earth elements comes from China. And so the power and influence of China over critical minerals have increased in the last few years, such that it's virtually impossible to envision a renewable energy transition without China playing a key role at some point in the supply chain. The transition, therefore, will not necessarily create greater energy independence, but it could just as easily lead to new dependencies. Now, will China be able to play the disruptive role with energy transition minerals that OPEC has played with oil? I don't know, but I don't necessarily think it would be as severe. I think it's partially a question of how ambitious energy transition countries choose to be. To put it perhaps excessively bluntly, fossil fuels are essential to modern civilization. Renewables are not. They are a luxury at the present moment. If China makes energy transition minerals prohibitively expensive, then countries will be forced either to curb consumption and growth in the name of clean energy or to revert to fossil fuels. But at least in theory, they would have a choice. Then I'll bring it straight to the conclusion here. Okay, so at the end of the day, clear-headed thinking, I think, is about the transition requires acknowledging that a wish is not a fact. The Commission claims too much for the energy transition in their conclusion, and I cite them. Most importantly, they say, renewables improve human welfare in ways that are not captured by GDP statistics. Properly designed, they can be applied to promote social justice and human welfare, encourage local empowerment and local wealth generation, contribute to a safer climate, improve public health, and advance gender equality and educational opportunities. The adoption of renewable energy will ease progress towards all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and not just the goal that relates to universal, affordable, and clean energy. So, end quote. This is too wishy-washy and utopian. The transition will likely be slower than expected, and it has the potential to create as many problems as it solves. For the paradox of the clean energy transition is that, if I'm not mistaken, it's the first energy transition taking place not due to scarcity or inefficiencies in our present energy sources, but due to a sense of guilt and stewardship for the planet. And it's wonderful that we have that luxury to have that guilt and sense of stewardship. Now, I've thus far tried to avoid discussing climate change, even though it's the elephant in the room. It is the principal driver in my mind behind the urgency in the move to clean energy. And we are told we do not have much time and must act now. But can politics abide the transition? We shall see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that there are many questions from the audience. However, there is no time, as our keynote speaker yesterday would say, abundance in questions and scarcity in time. So as Scott agreed before the beginning of this panel, he will be available to take questions during the break or at the end if we have time after other speakers.